Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to this third conversation, which is part of the series How to Write About War, and based on the collection Insurgent Feminisms, edited by Bhakti Sringapure and Varushka Kanteli. You'll have to forgive me as a moderator. I am in Nairobi and we just had a power cut and a deluge of rain. So therefore, I look like I'm in the dark, and you can probably hear the rain in the background. So good timing. Thank you, rain. Can you hear me, Danielle and Valerie?
Yes, we can. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So we've all been part of this book, and today's conversation is called Wounds of War on Health and Healing. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to consider these especially crazy times that we're living in and the ongoing genocide in Gaza, in which over 35,000 people have been killed. And the theme of hospitals and health is especially relevant in this context, with the Israeli assault targeting hospitals all over Gaza. In recent weeks, we've heard about 49 or so bodies that were found in Al-Shifa Hospital. We've also heard the story of Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, who was tortured to death in an Israeli prison, and countless other stories of health workers, patients killed inside and around hospitals. So I'm Zahra Moloo. I'm a journalist, filmmaker, and more recently a PhD candidate in human geography at the University of Toronto. And my work in health was done with the ETC group, and we were investigating genetically modified mosquitoes for malaria eradication in Burkina Faso, and especially the ways in which the Gates Foundation and the US military funded research into this very dangerous genetic modification technology that was targeted towards people in rural Burkina Faso. So on the theme of health, today I'll be speaking with two contributors, Valerie Gruhn, an emergency trauma nurse who in this book writes about her experience with Doctors Without Borders in Iraq, and Danielle Villasana, a photojournalist whose contribution in the anthology challenges stereotypes about trans women in Peru. So I'm going to start with you, Valerie. In this book, you write about your experience as an emergency nurse, specifically in Mosul in Iraq in 2017, when you were with Doctors Without Borders during a battle for the control of the city. And your account is extremely harrowing and really brings to mind, at least for me, what's happening in Gaza. You describe people who come into the emergency room with missing limbs, people with horrific injuries, children who are malnourished. And so I'm wondering, why did you choose to write this piece, and how did you feel writing it and narrating the kinds of pain that you witnessed in Iraq?
When I chose to write this piece, it was something that I chose to do really at the beginning of my assignment. I already knew what the context was and what the situation was, but what I didn't know was what I would experience, and I thought that I should write it down. So I didn't choose to write the piece for any specific purpose, but to just write down what I was experiencing. And over time, the piece evolved, and I would go back and forth on providing more context at the beginning, especially as I didn't really know Iraq or so much what the like ins and outs of the conflict. And but as the piece evolved, it became very cathartic to me, and I needed to write at certain points to release a lot of the emotions and the feelings that I felt as I was experiencing these moments with patients or with coworkers. And it was often also the only time that I had to pause. So as the conflict evolved, I became very much more, I would say, as a nurse at the beginning, you often end up, I don't know how to say it, but not that you're detached, but you choose to have a distance so that you can take care of these patients. But this became more and more difficult with the conflict, and the longer I was there, the more I became a part of the conflict, a part of the culture, a part of the team. Um, and so it wasn't until I came home and I reread this piece that I realized that actually this is something that I should probably publish, especially since many people didn't really know what was going on in Iraq, and were so detached from the situation over there that I felt like I just needed to broadcast it out there and be like, "Wake up! This is what's happening in Iraq, and this is what these people have dealt with, and even me." And and I was angry, which is why I broadcasted it and I wanted it published. But the challenge also for me was that when you write a piece like that is to be able to represent the Iraqis in the proper light, right? What I was an outsider, and it was really difficult for me to, and important as well, that I was going to represent my colleagues and my friends and Iraqis, and especially the people that I worked with and experienced these moments with, in the right way, so that they could see themselves in these pieces.
And I wonder, you speak about your experience, as a non-Iraqi, and you're coming to a place where there's a lot of death and a lot of pain. And in your piece, you write, people who survived had lost everything they had. They lost their homes, their limbs, their loved ones. I'd never seen so many wounded children. I never understood what it's like to live in a place where just being alive means you're privileged. And so, how did you, and perhaps how do you still grapple with your own positionality as someone who was witness to this war, but you also could leave, and you also had, I guess, the means, the privilege of remaining alive?
It's complicated. Iraq is still very much an open wound for me, and I don't think I realized it so much until Gaza happened again, and it was like bringing me back to Mosul. Um, at the time, Mosul was considered like one of the worst wars since World War II. They considered it like to be like World War III, and it was it was very similar to what is happening in Gaza, but also very different in other ways. And being in such a war takes a toll on you, I think, over time. But I didn't want to actually leave. So the way that our assignments work is that we're told when we're going and when our assignment ends. And having an end time to these assignments is actually a little bit helpful because it prepares you mentally to know, like, okay, I have a week left, I have 1 month left. There are certain things that I need to do. And then you also can prepare yourself to part from people as well. But in the case of Iraq, that didn't happen. We had we were evacuated. So we were attacked twice over a period of 2 weeks, and ended up having to evacuate. And the way that works is that something happens, and then you're pretty much just told, this is done. You're going back to headquarters, or like where the country office is. We're gonna discuss these, and then the things that happen, and then see whether you go back or not. And then when we were back in Erbil, this is where we had our coordination. We were told that we were not going back. So I never had an opportunity to say goodbye to my friends and colleagues, and that was something that I still very much struggle with. It reminded me once again of my privilege, in a sense, and that I, first of all, get to leave, right? I get to leave a place like that, and I get to go home, to be fine, to walk outside, to go to the store, to just daily life, the daily activities of life, right? Which can't happen in a place, in a war zone. And but also I realized just my privilege of just the fact that, you know, I went over there and I felt like I was like them, but I'm not. And again, this is why I think it was so important for me to be able to tell their story, because I don't think we realize how lucky we are half the time, you know.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people feel like that. When it comes to Gaza, like we are here living our lives, those of us who are safe, and yet this genocide is continuing at exactly the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I think that when it comes to Gaza, I also feel so guilty that I can't even go and help. Being that I've gone to so many war zones, you know, and there's not even that choice so much. I mean,
Yeah, sense of helplessness. Well, Danielle, I'm going to turn to you, and you know, your piece is very different. Your piece is about a trans woman, a sex worker in Peru, Piojo, who you write about her, and she's admitted to hospital with tuberculosis, contracted from having HIV and then AIDS. But it seems like your piece more broadly is about the challenges facing trans women in a conservative, quite transphobic society. It's a very different take to, you know, war, writing about the injured body. So I'm curious what prompted you to write this piece, and how do you see the injured body through your own writing?
Hello. So that story is part of a long-term project that I've been dedicated to for more than 10 years now, looking at the life-threatening challenges that transgender women face throughout the Americas, because now I'm focusing on trans migrants who have made it, you know, to the United States. And so this long-term project started in Argentina, and then I continued it when I moved and was living in Peru, and, you know, has since, you know, I've looked at other factors and added chapters to this long-term project. So it wasn't, you know, just a sort of like one-off story for me in the topics that I focus on. And, you know, I guess primarily as a photojournalist, we try to tell stories visually through photographs. But I believe in the power of, you know, combining text with photography, with even other elements that can help convey, you know, these sometimes impossible, you know, facts and to imagine. And so I felt like, you know, that was a story that really could benefit from text, because there's a lot that you can't show necessarily through images, such as, like, what is the word I'm looking for? Like structural discrimination, like how, you know, or even Piojo's past, you know, she had been rejected by her adoptive parents and had experienced a lot of abuse and trauma as a child. So there, you know, I couldn't photograph that because it was in the past. So, you know, but being able to include that through text and context of Piojo's life. And so that's how I, you know, decided that this was actually a piece that warranted text as well. And in fact, this chapter of my long-term project, which is called A Light Inside, I actually published as well into a book. So that includes, you know, obviously a lot of text. And yeah, again, just being able to like leverage the power of text with photography and leverage the power of photography with text. That's you know, there was just a lot that you can't explain sometimes through images. I mean, I love photography because it's almost a universal language sometimes, right? But depending on who you are as a person and where you're coming from and your experiences and your knowledge, like you may interpret an image in a different way than someone else. So I think that's where text can also be really important, not only to explain things that can't be shown through images, but also to make sure that the message that you want to convey is being conveyed. Yeah, so that's how, you know, it came about for me to write, in addition to the photography.
Okay. And so in your piece, the story you tell about Kyoko is that she goes to hospital when, you know, because she's ill, but she's already in need of urgent care. And you explain that it's very difficult for trans people to go to hospital because of these structural issues, because of the discrimination they face, not having government identification cards or health insurance. Can you tell us a bit or explain why there's this complex diversity of factors that make it hard for trans people in Peru to access healthcare?
Yeah, and I would, you know, argue that it's difficult for trans women, you know, worldwide to access, you know, basic human rights, upward mobility, because of, you know, structural discrimination and transphobia, these very deep-rooted phobias that really begin even in childhood. So Peru is not unique in that, you know, it's a more conservative society, and these issues really begin in childhood, where women face discrimination and rejection from family members, from the church, at school, and their gender identity is not recognized, and so there's a lot of trauma and conflict around that, and so it sort of offsets this snowball effect that just continues to build throughout their lives. So from rejection at an early age, oftentimes trans women will leave the home at an early age, you know, 13, 14, even younger sometimes, and find themselves, you know, without any sort of family support, without any economic support. And because of the inability to find employment, again, because of that transphobia and discrimination, because, you know, looking for employment, you know, oh, my name is, you know, Alexa. Oh, well, that doesn't match the gender identity on your identification. So if you want to come and work here, you have to come, you know, appearing as your, you know, sex on your identification card. So then there's a inability to find employment, which then leaves oftentimes sex work as people's only option. And then sex work exposes women to violence from clients, police, partners. And, you know, when I lived in Lima, I lived in the neighborhood that the women I was photographing also live in. So, I mean, the police presence is constant. I mean, it's just all of the time. And then again, it's not only the discrimination and the violence that people are exposed to in the family, in the home space, on the streets, but then also in spaces like educational spaces and hospitals. And so there's a great fear that trans women often have by, you know, they don't even want to go to the hospital because they've heard from friends, or they, you know, they know someone who died because they couldn't get the care that they needed because, you know, of transphobic comments that were made, or even just fellow patients, you know, that, you know, fear of even having to be in spaces that are not welcoming. And so oftentimes, you know, people will wait until it's too late, right? Because oftentimes it's like, okay, you hold out, but then you got to go, right? And then it's too late, especially with things like HIV and then those sort of opportunistic diseases that occur as a result. So yeah, it's just, it's like, it's a snowball effect. And so my intention, you know, with the work that I do and with, you know, for example, the book that I published is try to, raise awareness and educate people outside of the trans community about these very real consequences that transphobia and discrimination can have on trans women's lives. And just to throw like a couple of statistics out there, most trans women throughout Latin America don't live past 35 years old, and nearly 80% of trans homicides globally occur in Latin America. So, this discrimination and transphobia has like very, very dire consequences for these communities throughout Latin America, and in the world. I mean, we have to really look at the numbers and think, are there even numbers being gathered in other regions, right? So because of the visibility of trans folks in other regions versus Latin America.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's the problem here in Kenya as well, the kind of transphobia that's led to people being killed. And as you say, it's so many interconnected aspects of that. Well, I want to ask you both specifically about the injured body. Valerie, your piece really, as we were saying, really makes us think of what's happening in Gaza, where images of injured bodies are all over social media. So, people are saying that this specific genocide is the most documented genocide that we've ever seen. But what does it mean to narrate, to write about the injured body, or to narrate the kind of story that you did, when there isn't an outcome after all this outrage of seeing and witnessing and writing, and when the injured bodies keep arriving, like when this genocide keeps going on for months and months, and in Iraq, where this war went on for years. And Danielle, in your piece, I would say, the injured body, again, like you say, carries the impact of this accumulation of different factors, of structural violence, of gendered violence. So what happens when these injuries sort of go on over the long term and persist, either because of this genocide, or for instance, in your case, in your piece, Danielle, from sort of structured violence?
I guess I'll go first. So I think it's still important to narrate the injured body, even if a war continues for a long period of time, because it's more powerful than just hearing numbers, right? So when you're hearing, there are 13,000 children who have died, right, in Gaza. The number, obviously the number is you're like, wow, this is incredibly, it's incredible how many kids have died. But the impact that you have on an individual, that you can have on a person, I don't know if it's the same when you hear a story behind it, right? So, and I think I dealt with that while I was while I was writing these stories, because it's not easy to narrate the wounded body either, because if you make it too gore, right, or if you're too medical in your terms, then you're going to lose an audience that might not want to hear these stories, right, or an audience who just doesn't understand all this medical terminology and all this jargon that is very boring for some, right? And then, but at the same time, it's also difficult because as you're telling these stories of people who may have passed, right, or who survived, you're telling somebody's life. And so when you're narrating their body, and then this is also just being respectful to an individual's body altogether, even if you're talking about it, right, you want to make sure that you're giving them the dignity and the respect, right, that they deserve when you're telling their story. And so as I was writing the stories of these patients, I was very raw in my first draft. The draft that I chose to publish was edited multiple times, and I checked with friends who were who are medical and who are not medical on like, you know, what can you handle, right? What should I leave out in a sense or reduce, so that you continue reading, because the goal isn't to lose people either. But I still wanted it to be strong enough to know that this was really terrible. And ultimately, I think the purpose in narrating these patient stories is to prompt a reader to, what, at least for me, it was to prompt a reader to reevaluate and relearn the Iraqi story. I think there's a certain narrative that's been that's in place, right, in the media, and what we learn even in school and politicians, and I wanted to rehumanize my friends, and I think that the reporting that's coming out of Gaza right now, right, it's done by, you know, some people are reporters, some people are writers. I think they're doing the same thing, right? They're trying to rehumanize people that are where the narrative in the media is a complete opposite. So yeah, so that was my goal.
Danielle.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Valerie said resonates a lot and is, you know, very much in line with what I was thinking. So, you know, Valerie said it all. No, I'm kidding. I'll add to that. But yeah, I think because of social media, because of the nature of the media in general, how fast moving it is and how accessible it is, there is an overabundance of images and stories. And so we definitely, I think, run the risk of desensitizing you know, the injured body and pain and war and poverty. And, you know, it's really easy, I think, for, you know, people to just keep swiping or keep scrolling, you know, the doomsday scroll, right? It's like we're just constantly being flooded with images of pain. So for me as a photojournalist, whether that's in a long-term project or even on a one-day assignment, I try to show the broader story or the broader context of an issue to push back against, you know, stereotypes or very narrow narratives that in the media. In fact, one of the reasons that I wanted to start my long-term work on trans communities and why I've sort of stuck with it is because, especially at the time when I started this work, you know, more than 10 years ago, I didn't see the types of stories in the media that that honor the humanity of these communities, that, you know, just show sort of the daily life, almost mundane, but to me beautiful daily life moments that we can all relate to. You know, playing volleyball with friends, giggling on the bed together, like on a, you know, slumber party, or, you know, just these moments that like most of us can relate to, right? Love, friendship. And there weren't pictures like that in the media at the time, especially at that time. I would say it has changed a lot, especially as more trans photographers get behind the lens. These narratives are becoming much more complex and really honoring the reality of these women's lives, that it's not all pain and, you know, suffering. Of course, that is a factor that we don't want to ignore because it affects, you know, life expectancy, and, you know, there has real consequences. But I think if we can paint a fuller picture, and as Valerie said, you know, honor people's humanity and honor the dignity and push back against these misconceptions in the media, hopefully it can make people pause, you know, when they're doomsday scrolling, right? Like, oh, that's something that jumps out to me because it's saying something different. And so I try to do that in my work. Think about, okay, what are the misconceptions? And sometimes it isn't even that like intentional, but I'm trying to look at the full picture, right? Those moments that seem mundane, but that are very profound because maybe it's one that we don't think about or we haven't seen. And on the topic of, you know, what we're seeing coming out of Gaza, you know, I find that, you know, the pictures, for example, that we see of children and families before what's happening now are really impactful, right? Because those images, you know, at birthday parties, at, you know, a baby shower, at a, you know, it's like these are images that show humanity and that that anybody anywhere can relate to, right? Not everyone, like Valerie mentioned earlier when talking about privilege, you know, not everyone can relate to war. So sometimes it's like, oh, moving on, you know, but if we can stop people to see other humans as humans, I think that can be really powerful in terms of educating and, you know, creating empathy, and then hopefully that empathy leads to other things like the choices we make and all of those things that then can have more ripple effects.
Yeah, I think the images of Gaza before are so sort of so startling when you compare them to now. And since, as you mentioned, Valerie, I think there's been such a concerted effort in the media of dehumanization that I think both your pieces and other forms of writing are, you know, I think in a way counter that sort of dehumanizing, this deliberate strategy of dehumanization that we see, especially with Gaza.
Right.
But I wanted to, sorry, did you want to say something?
No.
I wanted to just go back to the fact that you're actually, Danielle, you're a photojournalist, and Valerie, you're a clinician. So you both have this work that you do, and then you're also doing this writing. So I wonder if you can talk about how you managed to, you did talk about this before, Danielle, the way the image doesn't tell the whole story, and so the writing sort of goes into more of the depth of that. But can you talk about how you managed to do those two things in the context of your work, Valerie, in terms of working as a clinician, but then also in a way standing outside in order to narrate, and what you've spoken about how the act of narrating has an impact in our world and what you want people to know. But how do you work with your two sort of hats of working as a clinician and being very hands-on, and then also writing about what you've seen? And Danielle, if you can also talk a bit more about the process of taking images, making images, but then also thinking about the let's say the more detailed side of the stories you tell.
Danielle, I'll let you answer first. I have to think about it.
Valerie's like, it's your turn to go first.
No, I'm just a little bit more.
I'm like, dang, okay. Yeah, I mean, as a photojournalist, I mean, the way that I can tell stories and using my strengths is like through images, I mean, that's my tool that I go to. And being a journalist is hard, as a photographer. It's like, I don't have to make a whole lot of phone calls to representatives and stuff like that. I always joke that, the photojournalists kind of have the fun job. But it's not. I think so. I mean, it's just really important. I mean, you can't put something out there without context, right? Even if it's something as simple as a caption. And so I joke about that, but I mean, there's a lot of like research and investigation that goes into even like photo-based stories, right? Because I mean, even before I started this long-term project, and throughout it, of course, there are lots of times when I'm, sitting down to research and read. And I mean, there's a lot of reading and a lot of writing that goes into it. And again, just kind of leveraging the power of photography. I mean, we haven't talked about like audio or video elements. I mean, there have been times where I've incorporated, video and audio into the work as well, because just to hear someone's voice is so powerful. Like I love radio journalism because you can hear people and their voices, and there's something really, really powerful about that. I mean, on my website under A Light Inside, there are, some video clips as well that where you can hear women's voices, alongside their portrait. So I think, again, just using those tools in unison is really can be more impactful than just one medium or one element on its own. So yeah, just any way to try to connect with the reader or to get someone to stop and look at, your piece. They work hand in hand beautifully together. And not only that, but it's important, to it's not, I mean, art is amazing too. I'm not to knock art, but the beauty of art is that you can interpret it however you want, right? But in journalism, because it's, we're trying to convey facts and truth, and you have to provide context through research, and you can't just put something out there and hope that people like get the message that you're trying to convey, right? We really have to have all of these things work hand in hand. Whereas like with art, there's more freedom to interpret it based on who you are, your life experience, and that's why it's also really powerful. So I hope I didn't go off on a little tangent there. And not to knock art. I mean, art is also, right, it's all meaningful. But I think the meaningfulness of journalism is different. And yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of different forms of documentary, the sort of investigative journalistic type that's one feels is impactful because it addresses the sort of factual elements, but then you have all these narrative documentaries where you have just a personal story that you follow, but then it's difficult to get the deeper context in there. So yeah, I guess they all have different ways of having an impact on the world. What about you, Valerie? Your work is as an emergency clinician, a nurse, and also then you're also writing. So
Right.
How do you manage those two?
So I think that if you're a clinician who works in a war zone or who works with an NGO, right, works in a crisis that's going on anywhere in the world, in a sense, like it's our duty to also, as people who are bearing witness to a lot of atrocities, to also bring these stories back. And it's not that simple for us, because I mean, we're not like, I don't really consider myself a writer in any way. I'm a clinician, I'm a humanitarian aid worker, and yes, I've written, but to think of myself as a writer, I think it's a reach in a sense. But for me, it comes with a purpose, to be able to bring back stories that often don't actually reach people here, right? Because they're being censored either in the news in some way, or but also to educate people. And I think as clinicians, we're also educators, right? We educate our colleagues, we educate on the field, but we also educate with stories. And I think that's important to do as a clinician.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which, your work as a photojournalist, your work as a clinician, Valerie, and the writing you do about the injured body? I mean, we're talking about people who are, very vulnerable. Is there a way in which this kind of work can end up being co-opted by humanitarian organizations, NGOs, government institutions? Can narratives about vulnerable bodies be misused?
Absolutely. I know that for the NGO that I worked for, we're very careful in how we will report on something or describe things, because it has huge implications on even like the security of our staff on the field, or a project even. When I came back from that specific assignment, given that the fact that this project was closed after I was evacuated, it didn't have many implications for that specific project, but it did for other MSF sections, you would say, and other people who were currently working in our projects. So you have to be really careful and how you will, I guess, bear witness, right, or broadcast some of these things that you've witnessed, especially because it can have a huge impact on the project and on the mission. And we're seeing this in Gaza, I'm sure, where the more we're speaking against what's happening, the more it's difficult for entry. That's most likely why humanitarians cannot enter Gaza the way that we are able to enter in other places, because you don't want people to speak out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that narratives can be misused by all kinds of entities, because everyone has a not goal, but what's the word I'm looking for? Everyone has a
sentence strategy.
What was it? An agenda. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know it's 6 p.m. for some of you, but it is still morning for me. But an agenda. Thank you. And I think what I love so much about being a journalist is that, of course there is bias and we have to be really careful of that. But I think what I love about journalism is that it really is striving for, like, these are the facts and this is the truth. And, that's what we're striving for, right? Of course, in practice, it is not often, it often misses the mark, which again, that kind of goes back to, like, my goal as a photojournalist is to try to think about that a lot and how that affects my approach as an individual. So absolutely. I mean, this can also, be co-opted by humanitarian or governmental organizations. And I think that's why it's really important to think about, as a photographer, to think about copyright, where you are allowing your photos to go and how they're going. Because as a photographer, sometimes, like, if I try to get a story published in a publication, oftentimes, there might be a writer assigned to that story. And if it's something so personal, like this project I've been working on for more than 10 years, it's really important, for me to have some sort of, like, not control, but like to make sure that the narrative is being told and that in a way that is most true to what is actually happening, right? That it's not sensationalized in any way. So I think there's, like, we have to be really careful with the work that we do and where it ends up and in whose hands it ends up in. And sometimes, you know, as a journalist who just gets assignments, sometimes I don't always have that control. But that's why personal work to me is, I mean, that's another factor of why personal work is so valuable, I think, because you do get to have a little bit more control of the narrative. And I mean, in my personal experience, I mean, again, intentionality, right? I've partnered with, you know, NGOs or, for example, with A Light Inside, I partnered with a very prominent trans activist in Peru, Leila Huerta, to, you know, talk about this issue and to, you know, provide the book A Light Inside free of charge to, you know, universities and clinics and hospitals. So that was a positive experience that I had. But there's an intentionality there, right? And making sure that, you know, everyone is like on the same page about whatever it is that, you know, you're focusing on that or that you're working on, right? So I do think that we need to be very careful about, you know, who we work with and have those conversations because, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, because everyone has an agenda, you know, NGOs need to fundraise and, you know, I mean, everyone is trying to, but I think what, at least in my experience, being able to partner with, you know, NGOs like Amnesty International, it's like, again, just having those conversations about what is the goal that we're all trying to accomplish here and how can we work together to do that in a way that respects, right, the issue or the people or the communities and that doesn't like use their pain, you know, to accomplish another end, you know? So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we have to be careful about. Yeah.
Zahra, what's your experience been when it comes to writing about war? Just curious.
So I was a humanitarian reporter many years ago. I used to work for what's now the New Humanitarian, and I covered some of what was happening in the West Bank in Palestine in 2012, and also went to Libya to look at what was happening in terms of the humanitarian stories when after Gaddafi had been was killed in Libya. I do more environmental reporting and looking at sort of extraction, mining, conservation, and violence around those topics now. But what I thought was really interesting about this idea of weaponization is certainly in the case of Gaza, of course, is the extent to which, even though there's a genocide, even though that's the real, a material, actual killing of people, you're still, you know, Israel is still able to justify it as they are the ones in pain, as they are the ones who are reacting to pain, or they are the ones who've been attacked. So it's just very interesting in terms of narrative, ways in which pain and the injured body can be instrumentalized in that way. And on the counter side of that, I mean, really disgusting and horrific. You know, in the early months of the genocide, those videos that came out of Israelis making fun of Palestinians being bombed and sort of putting on costumes and mocking them. And so there are just these different ways in which bodies and pain and these kind of what's happening has been, there's just so many different aspects to it. And the instrumentalization of pain is something that's so central to what you know, everything that's happening with Palestine. And, you know, including, you know, using homophobia as a kind of way to say, well, if you were gay in Palestine, what would happen to you? And someone wrote today, well, you'd be killed in the genocide on Gaza, as opposed to, you know, the pink washing that Israel always uses to say, well, oh, if you're a gay person, then you'd be treated so badly in Palestine, you know. So it's just different ways in which I think there are these very serious, like very real killings of people and a genocide, and then you have this kind of whole other narrative of instrumentalizing pain in this way. So it just made me think about that. But yeah, I don't know if that's been part of your thinking on this at all.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, when I watch what's going on or see what's going on, it's very much, it's very obvious, at least to somebody like us, to people like us, right? What is being done by Israel in terms of the narrative, but people believe it. I think Zahra, we...
Yeah, a little. I was like, uh-oh. Yeah, and just to, I think that's why the role of, like you said, humanitarian organizations being allowed to go into conflict, zones, not only in Gaza, but around the world, and journalists as well. A lot of the information that we're getting out of Gaza is from journalists who are there, who are from Gaza, who are working there. And of course, we've seen a lot of deaths of journalists as well, unprecedented. So I think that's something, that we also need to consider, how journalists are also targeted, around the world as a way to, silence, stories and truth that are, coming out of, certain situations like war. Mexico also is a very dangerous place for journalists. So, it's definitely, a fear, right, that that journalists shouldn't have for simply telling the truth of what's happening on the ground. And so, yeah, unfortunately, that's a reality that journalists also, have to deal with, is like their own personal safety and just trying to get the truth out.
Right.
I wonder if, just going back to your pieces, I'm curious now that, you've been away for a while, I guess, from Iraq, Valerie, and Danielle, I'm not sure if you've been back or have been still reporting on Peru, but can you tell us if anything sort of changed since you wrote these pieces? You mentioned that you really wanted people to know the story of Iraq and about your friends, and to have a sort of rehumanization of what was happening, Valerie, in writing this piece. And Danielle as well, like, did you, very sadly, well, I don't know if I should mention this, but in your piece, the character you write about passes away. And so has anything changed in terms of access to healthcare? What's been the development since you've written these pieces?
Valerie, if you don't mind,
go ahead.
I'll go first. I'm like, this is one where I do know what I'm going to say. I'm just kidding. So, okay, I'll kind of go backwards. So Piojo, yes, she is, she unfortunately passed away very shortly. She passed away very shortly after I met her. After Piojo passed away, a trans woman that I had started photographing at the very beginning, she was one of the first trans women I was started photographing in Lima, and the person that I was closest to in terms of, like, documenting her daily life, like all the time. If I wasn't at work, it was like I was dedicated to, photographing this community, and oftentimes it was Tamara. And when Piojo passed away, because it was Tamara who had introduced me to Piojo, she sort of, I say confessed because it was so hard for her. I mean, we have a string of text messages where she's like, look, I want to tell you something, but I'm scared to tell you. And, trying to, like, navigate that as a journalist, not like, oh, well, you can tell me, but like allowing space for the person to, like, tell me when they're ready. She told me that, she also has HIV. And so she went through the same process as Piojo, trying to navigate the healthcare system. And then unfortunately, she also got tuberculosis. So she was dealing with that simultaneously. And just the way the healthcare system is structured and the public healthcare system is really, really tough, like really hard. And so then you add the added layer of or vulnerability of being trans, it's just almost impossible. But, she really was dedicated to, sticking with the treatment. And but it was really tough. It was really tough. And unfortunately, Tamara also passed away. And it was right after her 30th birthday. And she, one of the things that I always remember her saying actually is, why would I live past 30 in a world that treats me less than human? I mean, this is something that she would say, almost one of the first things she said to me when we were first starting to get to know each other. And in the same way that I think, Valerie, someone at some point mentioned, like, we don't think that these things are going to happen to us, like the privilege. I felt like, because I was so close to Tamara, I just thought, like, I don't know, I just never considered that she could also be part of these, like, horrific statistics. And so I dedicated the book to Tamara. And in 2018, when I went back to Peru, so I lived in Peru for 3 years from 2013 to 2016, but kind of continuously went back at least once a year up until the pandemic. In 2018, I went back to launch the book and collaborate with Leila Huerta and, a university to give educational campaigns throughout the city. I went back to the hospital. Dr. Matos is included in the piece that I wrote to tell him about the book and to try to see if we could have, a presentation at the hospital. And that is when he told me, actually, like, and it's a public hospital right behind the community where, the women that I was photographing live. And he said, we are opening up this consultation area specifically for trans women. So an area of the hospital where trans women can go and it's just for them, right? So they don't have to face like other patients. They're dealing with doctors and nurses who are educated about trans issues. Even something so simple as using the name that they say, this is my name, as opposed to the one that might be on their identification card. And this was, I think, probably still to date, the only public and probably private hospital, don't quote me, but could be pretty certain about that has a consultation area only for trans women. And that was amazing to me. I mean, I was like, wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much. Like, and he said, thank you. Like, had you not been doing your work, because every time Tamara and Piojo would go to the hospital, I was with them, obviously, to, photograph. And so we had a lot of conversations. And he said, thanks to you and your work, I wouldn't have even known that this issue was in my backyard because, like I said, the community and the hospital were very close. So there's definitely a power in storytelling and documentation that can reach people who should know about this, but maybe, again, because of discrimination and transphobia, on the same way that, sexism affects, men too, right? So that was really an incredible positive change that happened in the time since, writing that piece. Unfortunately, very recently, the government, and it like just happened. So, there's a lot more like research that I need to do to have the language around it. But, basically the government now identifies trans people as mentally ill. And that has happened, very recently in Peru. So it's really disheartening to, see such a positive step for accessing healthcare for trans women, years ago to then, seeing something like this happen in legislation. So, I think it's oftentimes, 2 step forwards, 1 step back. But so those are some things that have happened since then.
Wow, quite major developments. Valerie, have you heard from your friends in Iraq? Have you stayed in touch with them? Can you tell us a bit about the time when you wrote this piece until now? What have been some of the changes in Mosul where you were?
Right, sure. So while I was there, it was the height of the battle. So I was there really only a short 3 months, even though it felt like for a lifetime. During that time, it was the height of the battle. And when I was evacuated, so this was towards June. The battle, which I didn't know at the time, actually ended 3 weeks later. And so they had intensified their strategy. And I'm not sure if you know what the context fully is, but it was an international coalition against the Islamic State. And the Islamic State had a very small territory left, which was about 1 kilometers away from the last hospital, where I was working out of. So the battle was very much concentrated in that area. Then I was evacuated. The war was concluded as being officially won, I guess, the battle, several weeks later, which then only really meant that, the military kind of retreats, and then people really get to, I guess, see the effects, right, of what has been going on. So it's a lot of, so many families obviously were displaced. Children, there were a lot of children who became orphans from this battle, and many of them ending up in internally displaced camps. There was actually a story of a young girl who ended up in our hospital. She was injured at the front line. She was, I think, about 3 years old, and she arrived by herself. And I became her caretaker over a period of a few days, while we were trying to figure out, is there a way that we can find her family so that she doesn't end up in this camp? And we kind of used social media, so Facebook, and just blasted her picture. And were able to get her uncle actually recognized her through social media, came to our hospital. I obviously became really overprotective because I'm like, who are you? Or do you really know this child? And he's like, yes, this is, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to say her name. And she had a beauty mark on her specific spot. And I asked him, I was like, she has a certain mark on her body. What is it? What color is it? And where is it? And he was like, oh, it's in this location. It's that color. And, so that's how I knew that he was actually family. And so I didn't actually give the child to him. He mentioned that the mother and her siblings, who were also injured in this blast, were just in another hospital further away. And so I asked him to bring the family so that they can be reunited in our hospital. And then that we would care for them there. So I, since then, have kept in touch with some people who I obviously built really strong relationships with, and did check in on her to see how she was doing, not directly, but through my contacts to see she's thriving. And she's living the life of a young girl who she's going to school. From what I heard, she's doing well. So she's someone that I will always remember, in terms of a story that really, or a person that really had a huge impact on me. And since then, Iraq obviously has rebuilt. So when I mention Iraq, obviously the war was very much focused in the north. So in Qayyara, Hamam al-Halil, Mosul, and so that region has been rebuilt, not fully, but that people are able to live life normal-ish since. As far as what the current context is like in reality, that I don't know. But I know that it's not the same context from when I worked there. So in a sense, it's better. Yeah. But yeah. Yep.
Oh, we lost Zahra.
Yeah. But your perspective, Danielle, and your I can very much, even though the context is very different, I can very much relate to a lot of things that you're saying. I think altogether, when you kind of work in this space, you get to see people differently, and which I often don't really see with a lot of people who have not actually been in that context. These conversations are important, and I'm glad that I was able to have it with you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, and there's I have a lot of, well, not a lot, but there are definitely, several photojournalists I know who have transitioned into medical care, whether that's becoming an EMT or, a nurse in conflict zone. So I think that, like you said, it's a cliche, but when you bear witness firsthand, there's something really powerful about that. And of course, the power and then trying to convey those experiences and what you see to others who can't be there, is really, really important. So, yeah. It's been an awesome conversation. I think we were about at time
Yes.
anyway. So Zahra was like, okay, I'm done. Bye. Yeah, it was a really, really important and lovely conversation. So
Zahra was in a power cut in Nairobi, so she won't be able to join anymore. But
yeah,
thank you everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you so much.